A shy florist delivered to the wrong address, unknowingly saving the recipient's life on a rain-soaked Tuesday in November. Ellie Matthews hadn't spoken more than 20 words that day, which wasn't unusual. Words tangled on her tongue when faced with strangers, so she preferred the silent company of her flowers. They communicated in color and fragrance, asking nothing more of her than tender care and understanding. The rain pattered against the windshield of her delivery van, a gentle rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Steady, predictable, safe. Ellie checked the address on the order form again, 1422 Willow Lane. The bouquet on the passenger seat, a vibrant arrangement of sunflowers, purple irises, and white lilies, seemed almost luminous against the gray backdrop of the dreary afternoon. A celebration of life bouquet, ordered by someone named Jennifer for her mother's birthday. Ellie pulled up to what she thought was 1422 Willow Lane, squinting through the rain-blurred windshield at the tarnished house numbers. The neighborhood was unfamiliar, the streets winding in confusing patterns through this older part of town. Victorian-style homes, once grand, now showed signs of neglect, peeling paint, sagging porches, overgrown gardens. She gathered the bouquet, cradling it protectively against her chest as she darted through the rain to the covered porch. Water dripped from her auburn hair down the back of her neck as she rang the doorbell. 30 seconds passed, a minute. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, considering leaving the flowers on the doorstep when the door finally creaked open. The man who appeared was tall, unshaven, with dark circles under bloodshot eyes. He wore a rumpled gray t-shirt and sweatpants that hung from his frame, as if they belonged to someone else entirely, someone with more substance. His confusion was immediate. "I didn't order any flowers," he said, his voice rough as if it hadn't been used in days. Ellie's chest tightened. Social interactions were difficult enough when they followed the script in her head. Unexpected responses sent anxiety spiraling through her body. Delivery for Jennifer? A birthday gift for her mother? Her voice emerged smaller than intended, nearly swept away by the sound of rain hitting the porch roof. The man's expression shifted, pain flashing across his features before settling into something hollow. "There's no Jennifer here." Ellie glanced down at her order form, then at the house number beside the door. 1422. "This is 1422 Willow Lane, right?" "Willow Lane?" He shook his head. "This is 1422 Wisteria Lane." Heat rushed to Ellie's cheeks. "I'm so sorry. I must have made a mistake." She was about to turn away, clutching the flowers, when something caught her eye. Beyond the man's shoulder, in the dimly lit hallway behind him, she glimpsed a small table. On it sat an empty bottle of whiskey, and beside it, more concerning, an orange prescription bottle on its side, lid off, contents spilled. Something in her stomach knotted. Something wasn't right. "Are you okay?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them, surprising her as much as him. His eyes narrowed. "I'm fine." But his voice cracked on "fine," and his grip on the doorframe tightened until his knuckles turned white. Ellie stood frozen, the rational part of her brain screaming to apologize again and leave. This wasn't her business. She wasn't good with people. She couldn't even deliver flowers to the right address. But something stronger, something that felt like the same instinct that told her when a plant needed water or light, or simply to be spoken to softly, kept her rooted to the spot. "These flowers," she said, words coming slowly, "they're meant to celebrate life." She held the bouquet out toward him like an offering. "Maybe they were meant to find you instead." The absurdity of the statement hung between them. He stared at her, then at the flowers, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Ellie thought he might slam the door in her face. Instead, his shoulders sagged, as if some invisible weight had become too heavy to bear. "You should go," he said quietly. "Thank you for the flowers, but they're wasted here." "No flower is ever wasted," Ellie replied, surprising herself again with the steadiness in her voice. "Even if they only bloom for a day, they've done what they were meant to do." A raindrop slid from her hair down her cheek like a tear. The man looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "Who are you?" "Just a florist," she said. "Who made a wrong turn." Something shifted in his expression, the smallest crack in a wall built to keep the world out. "I'm Daniel," he said after a long moment. "Ellie." Another silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of rain. "Those pills," she said finally, nodding toward the table behind him. "Were you going to—" He didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "Maybe I should come in," she said. "Just for a minute." "To put these in water." Daniel stepped back from the doorway, a barely perceptible movement, but an invitation nonetheless. Ellie crossed the threshold, bringing with her raindrops, flowers, and something else that had been absent from the house for too long: hope. The inside of Daniel Sullivan's house felt like a museum dedicated to a life that had stopped moving forward. Photographs on the walls showed a smiling family, Daniel with a petite blonde woman, and a little girl with her mother's smile and her father's dark eyes. But a fine layer of dust covered every surface, as if no one had touched anything in months. Ellie followed him to the kitchen, her wet shoes squeaking against the hardwood floors. The kitchen sink was filled with unwashed dishes, the counter cluttered with takeout containers and mail, some opened, most not. "Do you have a vase?" she asked quietly. Daniel opened and closed several cabinets before finding a clear glass vase cloudy with dust. He rinsed it under the faucet, movements mechanical. "How long has it been?" Ellie asked as she arranged the flowers in the vase, her fingers moving with practiced grace despite her discomfort. Daniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed defensively across his chest. "Since what?" "Since you lost them." His sharp intake of breath told her she'd guessed correctly about the absence in the photographs. For a moment, she thought she'd gone too far, crossed an invisible boundary. Social cues had never been her strength. 14 months, he finally said, voice barely audible. "Car accident, drunk driver." Ellie placed the vase of flowers on the kitchen table, pushing aside empty coffee mugs and unopened mail. The bright colors looked almost violent against the monochrome stillness of the house. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were inadequate but not knowing what else to offer. Today would have been Sophie's 8th birthday. His voice cracked. "My daughter." Understanding washed over Ellie. "The pills, the whiskey, the particular devastation of this particular day. The flowers found the right place after all," she said softly. "They're birthday flowers." Daniel's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall. "I was supposed to pick her up from school that day, but I got caught in a meeting. Maggie, my wife, she went instead." His hands clenched into fists. "If I had just left work on time?" Ellie felt her own throat tighten. She wasn't equipped for this. Her entire life had been structured around avoiding intense emotional situations, around the careful tending of plants because they didn't expect her to find the right words. "I should go," she said, suddenly overwhelmed. "I've intruded enough." As she turned to leave, Daniel spoke, his voice steadier than before. "The flowers. How much do I owe you?" Ellie shook her head. "Nothing. They were delivered to the wrong address, remember? But they were meant for someone else. I'll figure it out." She would pay for them herself, absorb the cost rather than try to explain the situation to her boss. Daniel studied her face, as if trying to understand her motives. "Why did you stay? When you realized I had the wrong address?" Ellie thought about the pill bottle, the empty whiskey container. She thought about how sometimes the plants in her shop would wilt even when given the right amount of water and sunlight, as if they'd simply lost the will to grow. "Because sometimes," she said carefully, "people need tending to, just like flowers do." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. Ellie Matthews, Petal and Stem Florist, with the shop's address and phone number printed in simple type below a small illustration of a lily. "If you want to talk, or just look at the flowers." She placed the card on the table beside the vase. Sometimes beauty helps, even when nothing else does. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time she left, hurrying back to her van with her order form clutched in her hand. As she pulled away from the curb, she glanced back at the house. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching her leave, a solitary figure framed by the darkness behind him. Ellie didn't know if she'd made any difference. She didn't know if the flowers would keep him from trying again tomorrow or the next day. But she had tried, had stepped outside the careful boundaries she'd built around her life and reached toward another human being in pain. The correct address, 1422 Willow Lane, was only 10 minutes away. She would deliver the explanation, but not the flowers. She would face her boss's disappointment, and then she would return to her quiet apartment with its window boxes full of herbs and its balcony crowded with potted plants, where she didn't have to find the right words or bear the weight of someone else's grief. But something had changed, as subtle as the greening of a stem or the unfurling of a new leaf. Something she couldn't yet name but could feel taking root inside her. 3 days passed before Daniel came to the flower shop. Ellie was helping an elderly woman select an arrangement for her granddaughter's piano recital when the bell above the door jingled and he stepped inside. She recognized him immediately, though he looked different in the soft light of the shop, less haunted, more substantial. He'd shaved, and his clothes were clean, though he still carried himself with the careful movements of someone afraid he might shatter. Her heart stuttered as he wandered among the displays, touching a petal here, leaning in to smell a bloom there. She finished with her customer, wrapping the chosen flowers in crisp paper and accepting payment with a quiet "thank you" before approaching Daniel. "You came," she said, hands nervously smoothing her apron. "The flowers died," he replied, "faster than they should have. I think I didn't change the water enough." A smile tugged at the corner of Ellie's mouth. "They need fresh water every day. And a clean vase. I figured that out too late." He picked up a small potted orchid, examining its delicate structure. "I thought maybe something living would be better. Something that lasts longer if you take care of it." Ellie gently took the orchid from him. "Orchids can be temperamental. Maybe something more forgiving for a beginner." She led him to a shelf of potted plants. "This is a peace lily. It's resilient, tolerates low light, and it tells you when it needs water by drooping a little. But it bounces right back when you give it what it needs." Daniel reached out to touch one of the lily's glossy green leaves. "It bounces back?" he repeated softly. "Some plants do that," Ellie said, her voice taking on the confident tone she only ever had when discussing her flowers. "They're stronger than they look." He bought the peace lily and a small African violet with purple blooms that reminded him of his daughter's favorite color. As Ellie rang up his purchase, he asked, "Do you deliver?" She felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Yes, but I'm not always the delivery person." "That's too bad." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "The last delivery I got was memorable." Ellie carefully wrote care instructions on the back of a business card, her handwriting small and precise. "Water the lily when it droops. Keep the violet moist but not soggy. Indirect light for both." Their fingers brushed as she handed him the card, and for once Ellie didn't pull away from the human contact. "Thank you," he said, "for the wrong delivery." After he left, Ellie found herself touching the spot where their fingers had met, the sensation lingering like the scent of jasmine in the air after sunset. Daniel didn't have a green thumb. This became evident over the next few weeks as he returned to the shop with questions about yellow leaves and dropping blooms. Each visit lasted a little longer than the one before. Each conversation extended beyond plant care to cautious personal revelations. Ellie learned that Daniel was an architect who hadn't returned to work since the accident, that he had been living on savings and insurance money, that he had grown up in this town but now felt like a stranger in it, avoiding places that held memories of Maggie and Sophie. Daniel learned that Ellie had always been shy, that words seemed to tangle on her tongue around people, but flowed easily when she spoke to her plants, that she lived alone with a gray cat named Sage, that she had studied botany in college before anxiety had overwhelmed her, leading her to drop out and find refuge in the flower shop, where quiet work with her hands brought her peace. They were both broken in different ways, Ellie realized one rainy afternoon as she demonstrated how to properly prune his now thriving peace lily. Daniel's brokenness was loud, a violent rupture in the life he had planned. Hers was quieter, a slow fracturing that had started in childhood and continued until she had built walls around herself, letting in only green-growing things that asked nothing of her but care. "Would you like to have coffee sometime?" Daniel asked as she wrapped the freshly pruned lily in paper to protect it from the rain outside. "Not here. Somewhere else." "Like people do?" Ellie's hand stilled on the paper. Fear rippled through her. The familiar anxiety of social situations, of expectations she might not be able to meet, of words that might fail her. But beneath the fear was something warmer, something that felt like the first tendril of a seed breaking through soil toward sunlight. "Yes," she said simply. "I would like that." The coffee shop was busy when they met the following Saturday. Too busy, too loud, too many people whose eyes might land on her, judging her awkwardness. Ellie's chest tightened as they waited in line, her eyes fixed on the menu board, although she always ordered the same thing, chamomile tea with honey. Daniel noticed her discomfort, the way her fingers twisted the strap of her purse, the shallow rhythm of her breathing. Without comment, he led her to a small table in the corner, positioning himself so that his broader frame blocked her from the rest of the room. "We can go somewhere else," he offered. Ellie shook her head. "It's fine. She took a deliberate breath. "Crowds are hard sometimes." "For me too," Daniel admitted. But for different reasons, I think. I look at all these people living their normal lives, and I feel like I'm watching from behind glass. Like I don't know how to be one of them anymore. His honesty settled her somehow. They were both outsiders in their own ways. When their drinks came, chamomile tea for her, black coffee for him, a comfortable silence fell between them. Not the strained silence of people searching for things to say, but the quiet understanding of two people who recognized the effort it took the other to be there at all. I started sketching again, Daniel said after a while. Buildings. It's what I used to do before computer programs took over the field. What kind of buildings? He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small sketchbook. Hesitantly, he opened it and pushed it across the table to her. The drawings were beautiful, intricate designs of structures that seemed to grow from the landscape around them, incorporating elements of nature into their forms. "These are amazing," Ellie said, genuine admiration in her voice. "They're like architectural gardens." Daniel's expression softened. "That's exactly what I was trying to capture. Spaces where the boundaries between inside and outside blur, where nature is invited in rather than shut out." She turned another page and stopped. The sketch showed a glass-domed building filled with flowers and trees, a conservatory of sorts, but with unique elements she hadn't seen before. Curved pathways wound through different climate zones, and small nooks created intimate spaces within the larger structure. "What's this one?" Daniel's hand moved as if to take the sketchbook back, but he stopped himself. "Just an idea. A dream project, I guess. A botanical center where people could experience different plant environments throughout the year, where the healing power of nature would be accessible even in the depths of winter." Ellie studied the drawing, noticing how the design created both open spaces for gathering and secluded corners for solitude. It was as if he had understood exactly what different types of people might need from such a place, those who sought community and those who sought quiet reflection. "You understand?" she said softly. "Understand what?" "How spaces affect people. How they can either comfort or overwhelm." Daniel took a sip of his coffee. "Architecture isn't just about buildings. It's about how people live within them, how they feel, how they heal." His voice caught on the last word. Ellie reached across the table, her fingers lightly touching the back of his hand. The gesture surprised them both. "The peace lily," she said. "How is it doing?" A small smile. "Still alive. I think it might even be happy." "Plants can't feel happy or sad," Ellie said automatically, then reconsidered. "At least not in the way we do. But they respond to care. They know in their own way when they're tended to properly." "And people?" Daniel asked. "Do they respond the same way?" Ellie thought about how she had retreated from human connections, preferring the simple give and take of caring for plants. How she had convinced herself that she was better off alone because people were complicated and unpredictable and potentially hurtful. But here she was, sitting across from a man who had wanted to end his life the day she knocked on his door. A man who was now buying plants and drawing buildings and asking questions about healing. A man whose grief was still evident in the shadows behind his eyes, but who was, against all odds, reaching toward light. "I think," she said carefully, "people need tending too. But it's more complicated because we can reject the care we need. Plants don't have that option." Daniel's hand turned beneath hers, his palm now facing upward, fingers gently curling around her own. "I'm glad you didn't leave that day, when you realized you had the wrong address." The warmth of his hand around hers felt both terrifying and right. "I'm glad too." Outside the coffee shop window, autumn leaves danced on a cool breeze, letting go of the branches that had held them all summer, surrendering to a necessary falling. Winter settled over the town like a heavy blanket, transforming the landscape into muted shades of gray and white. The flower shop bloomed defiantly against the monochrome background, windows steamed with the warm breath of tropical plants and forced bulbs that promised spring's eventual return. Ellie worked longer hours during the holiday season, arranging poinsettias and amaryllis, crafting wreaths from evergreen boughs and holly berries. December brought a parade of customers seeking to brighten their homes or send tokens of remembrance to distant loved ones. Daniel came by most evenings just before closing, sometimes bringing coffee or sandwiches from the cafe down the street. Their friendship had grown slowly, carefully, like a delicate plant sending out new roots. They hadn't defined what they were to each other, but they had developed rituals. Sunday morning walks in the park, weeknight dinners where they took turns cooking, quiet evenings where Ellie read botanical texts while Daniel sketched. The anniversary of the accident had come and gone in November, a day when Daniel had disappeared entirely, not answering texts or calls. Ellie had worried, fear gnawing at her as she remembered the pill bottle from the day they met. But he had appeared the next morning on her doorstep, eyes red-rimmed but clear, a small potted cyclamen in his hands. "I visited them," he'd said simply, "at the cemetery, for the first time since the funeral." She had held him then, standing in her doorway as the first snow of the season dusted their shoulders, his body shaking with silent sobs against hers. Now, as Christmas approached, Ellie noticed Daniel's mood darkening again. He still came to the shop, still shared meals with her, still tended to his growing collection of houseplants, but he seemed to retreat into himself a little more each day. "It's their first Christmas without them," he explained when she finally asked. They were at his house, which had gradually transformed over the months from a mausoleum of grief to a living space again. Plants occupied sunny windowsills. Sketches and architectural drawings covered the dining room table. Photos of Maggie and Sophie still hung on the walls, but they were now joined by new images. Daniel and Ellie at the botanical gardens in the neighboring city, both squinting against the sun. A close-up of the first bloom from his African violet. Ellie arranging flowers at the shop, unaware she was being photographed, her face serene and focused. "Last year I was still in shock," he continued. "Everything was a blur. But now," he gestured around the room, where subtle signs of the season had begun to appear, a small wreath on the wall, a bowl of pine cones on the coffee table. "Now I'm trying to live again, and it feels like a betrayal." Ellie moved to sit beside him on the couch, close enough that their shoulders touched. "It's not a betrayal to keep living," she said softly. "The plants in my shop, when they're cut for arrangements, they're already separated from their source of life. But they continue to bloom, to give beauty, to fulfill their purpose until the very end." Daniel's hand found hers, fingers intertwining. "Is that what I'm doing? Blooming even though I've been cut off from what nourished me?" "I think," Ellie said carefully, "you're putting down new roots. It doesn't erase what was lost. It just means you're finding a way to grow again." He was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. Sophie loved Christmas. She would be planning her list for Santa right now, even though last year she told me she knew the truth but was pretending for her mom's sake. A sad smile flickered across his face. "And Maggie would be hanging lights everywhere, baking cookies, wrapping presents weeks in advance." "What would you be doing?" Ellie asked gently. "Complaining about the ladder being wobbly while I hung lights outside. Eating too much cookie dough. Building a dollhouse that the instructions said would take 2 hours but actually took me until 3 a.m. On Christmas morning." His voice broke. "Being happy without even realizing how lucky I was." Ellie leaned her head against his shoulder. "Maybe we could do something, not to replace their traditions, but to honor them. And to create something new." Daniel turned to look at her, his expression vulnerable and open in a way that still surprised her. This man who had been ready to end everything the day she knocked on his door had slowly allowed her to see every broken piece of himself, had trusted her with his grief and his tentative steps toward healing. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. The idea had been forming in the back of Ellie's mind for weeks, ever since she'd seen Daniel's sketch of the botanical center. "Your drawings?" she said. "The conservatory design. What if we built a small version? A terrarium with different zones, different plants. A miniature world under glass." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "A living memory." "Yes," she nodded. "Something that grows and changes but is protected. Something that needs care." Daniel's arms encircled her then, pulling her against his chest in an embrace that felt like coming home. Ellie, who had once flinched away from casual touches, who had built her life around avoiding the messy intimacy of human connection, relaxed into his warmth. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For what?" "For delivering flowers to the wrong address." Christmas Eve arrived with a fresh snowfall that transformed the world into a glittering wonderland. Ellie closed the shop early, her final delivery of the day tucked carefully in the passenger seat of her van. The terrarium she and Daniel had created together over the past 2 weeks was a masterpiece of miniature landscape architecture, a glass-enclosed garden with tiny pathways winding through moss hills, diminutive ferns, and flowering plants, all arranged to reflect the design from his sketchbook. They had worked side by side in comfortable silence most evenings, his architect's precision complementing her knowledge of plant needs and compatibility. As the tiny world took shape under their hands, Ellie had watched Daniel's expression soften, the dark shadows in his eyes receding as he focused on creating something beautiful and alive. Now, as she navigated the snowy streets toward his house, anticipation fluttered in her chest. This would be their first Christmas Eve together, not a replacement for what he had lost, but the beginning of something new. Something neither of them had expected to find. Daniel opened the door before she could knock, as if he'd been watching for her arrival. The scent of pine and cinnamon greeted her as she carefully carried the terrarium inside. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, decorated with a mixture of store-bought ornaments and what appeared to be handcrafted decorations. Paper snowflakes, salt dough stars painted in uneven strokes, a construction paper chain. "Sophie made those," Daniel explained, following her gaze to the homemade ornaments. "Maggie saved everything she ever made. I found a box in the attic labeled Christmas Memories." His voice was steady, tinged with sadness but not overwhelmed by it. It felt right to hang them. Ellie set the terrarium on the coffee table. "It's perfect," she said, meaning both the tree and the feeling of the house, warm and inviting, honoring what was lost while making space for what might be. Daniel's hand came to rest at the small of her back as they stood looking at their creation. The terrarium caught the twinkling lights from the Christmas tree, the glass walls creating a magical interplay of light and shadow across the miniature landscape. "It's even more beautiful here," he said softly. "It belongs here," Ellie replied. "It's a living reminder that beauty can be protected without being isolated. That growth happens even in contained spaces." Daniel turned to face her, his hands gently cupping her face. "You saved my life," he said, the words barely above a whisper. "Not just that day with the pills. Every day since. Every time you showed me that it was okay to keep living, to find beauty again, to care for something beyond my grief." Ellie felt tears prick at her eyes. "You saved me too," she admitted. "I was hiding in my flowers, avoiding anything that might hurt." "Anything real?" And now, she placed her hands over his, anchoring herself in the warmth of his touch. "Now I'm terrified, and grateful, and more alive than I've ever been." His kiss was gentle at first, a question, an offering. When she responded, moving closer, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, the kiss deepened into something that felt like promise, like hope, like the first bloom after a long winter. Later, they sat side by side on the couch, a blanket draped over their laps, mugs of hot chocolate warming their hands as they watched snow fall outside the window. The terrarium on the coffee table created its own microclimate, a self-contained world where life flourished, protected but not isolated. "What happens next?" Daniel asked, his voice peaceful in a way Ellie had never heard before. She considered the question, thinking about the long, winding path that had led them here, a wrong delivery, a moment of intervention, months of careful tending to fragile new growth. "I don't know exactly," she answered honestly, "but I think we keep growing. Together." Outside, snowflakes danced in the glow of street lamps, each one unique, temporary, and perfect in its moment of falling. Inside, two people who had found each other through chance and pain and healing watched over their tiny created world, their fingers intertwined, their futures unfolding like leaves reaching toward light. Spring came early that year, as if nature itself was eager to begin again. Crocuses pushed through the last patches of snow, and buds swelled on tree branches, pregnant with possibility. In the flower shop, Ellie prepared for the busy season ahead: Easter arrangements, Mother's Day bouquets, graduation ceremonies, and the beginning of wedding season. The bell above the door chimed one Tuesday afternoon in April, and Daniel walked in, carrying the terrarium they had built together at Christmas. It had thrived under their joint care, the miniature landscape evolving as plants grew and sometimes needed to be trimmed back or replaced. "I brought our little world for some professional maintenance," he said, setting it carefully on the counter. But something in his expression told Ellie this visit was about more than plant care. "What's wrong?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "You look nervous." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of his anxiety. "I have something to show you, but not here." Ellie glanced at the clock. It was almost closing time anyway, and Tuesdays were slow. Let me just lock up. 20 minutes later, Daniel pulled his car into the parking lot of what appeared to be an abandoned commercial greenhouse on the outskirts of town. The glass structure was cloudy with dirt and neglect, but still intact, rising from the overgrown landscape like the skeleton of some great transparent beast. "What is this place?" Ellie asked as they got out of the car. "It used to be Hartman's nursery," Daniel explained, taking her hand as they approached the building. "It's been closed for about 5 years. The owner died and his children didn't want to continue the business." He pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the padlock on the main door. Ellie's confusion grew as they stepped inside. The interior was dusty and empty except for a few broken pots and rusted tools, but the structure itself was sound, acres of glass panels supported by an elegant framework of metal. Daniel watched her face as she took it all in, sunlight streaming through the dirty glass, creating dappled patterns on the concrete floor. "Remember my sketch? The Botanical Center?" Ellie nodded, beginning to understand. "You bought this place?" "Not exactly." He guided her to the center of the main greenhouse where a folding table had been set up. On it lay architectural drawings, professional versions of the sketch he had shown her months ago in the coffee shop. "I've been working with a developer who specializes in community-focused projects. They're interested in creating a botanical education center, a place that would be open to the public but would also offer therapeutic programs, classes for kids, a community garden space." Ellie leaned over the drawings, taking in the detailed plans. The old nursery would be transformed, its bones preserved but enhanced with modern systems for climate control and water conservation. The designs showed spaces for desert plants, tropical species, meditation gardens, and children's discovery areas. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's exactly what you imagined." Daniel squeezed her hand. "There's more. They need someone to oversee the plant selection and care. Someone who understands not just the horticultural aspects, but the healing power of connecting with growing things." He turned to face her fully. "They need someone like you, Ellie." She stepped back, overwhelmed. "Me? But I'm just a florist. I don't have a degree. I never finished school." "You have something more valuable than a degree," Daniel interrupted gently. "You have an innate understanding of what plants need to thrive and what people need to heal." Ellie looked around the empty greenhouse, trying to imagine it transformed, filled with light and life and possibility. It was too much to take in. "This is your dream," she said finally. "From your sketchbook." Daniel nodded. "It started that way, but now it's become something more. A way to honor what I've lost by creating something new. A place where beauty and healing can coexist with grief and memory." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "And I can't imagine building it without you." The sunlight shifted as a cloud passed overhead, momentarily dimming the greenhouse before brightening again. Ellie thought about the shy florist she had been when she delivered flowers to the wrong address that rainy November day, a woman who had built her life around avoiding risk, around the predictable company of plants, rather than the messy complexity of human connection. She thought about Daniel, who had been ready to surrender to his grief, to follow his family into darkness rather than find a way to live without them, who had instead found the courage to plant new seeds in the ashes of his previous life. And she thought about their terrarium, the miniature world they had created together, where each tiny plant had its place in a landscape designed with both aesthetic beauty and practical needs in mind. A protected space that was nonetheless open to change and growth. "When would all this happen?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. "The funding is in place. Renovations could start this summer." Daniel hesitated. "I know it's a lot to consider. You've built your life around the flower shop. This would be something completely different." Ellie walked to one of the glass walls, placing her palm against the cool surface. Outside, spring was asserting itself in every budding tree and emerging wildflower. Inside this empty structure, possibility waited, dormant but ready to flourish with the right care and attention. "A shy florist delivered to the wrong address?" she said softly, unknowingly saving the recipient's life. Daniel moved to stand beside her. "What?" "That's how this story began," she explained, turning to face him. "With a wrong delivery. A mistake that wasn't really a mistake." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "And now?" Ellie took both his hands in hers, feeling the strength in them, hands that had nearly surrendered their purpose, but had instead found new ways to create and build and hold. "Now the story continues," she said. "With a garden where people can heal, with work that matters, with two people who were lost and found each other." Daniel's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, gradual, warm, transformative. "Is that a yes?" Instead of answering with words, Ellie rose on tiptoe and kissed him, there in the empty greenhouse that hummed with potential. It wasn't the kiss of a shy florist or a grieving widower. It was the kiss of two people who had learned that growth often begins in the broken places, that beauty can emerge from the most unexpected circumstances, and that sometimes the wrong address leads exactly where you need to go. Above them, light poured through glass panels that would soon shelter new life, a cathedral of growth where their separate journeys had converged to create something neither could have imagined alone. A place where flowers would bloom and people would heal, where grief and joy could coexist, where the most tender shoots would be protected until they were strong enough to thrive. A place that had begun with a delivery to the wrong address and a life unknowingly saved.